Hi, I'm Nitin Sethi, and we are entering the thematic panel looking at operationalizing sustainable lifestyles using thinking about technologies and behavioral shifts that would make it possible. This is part of the CVF virtual summit, and I welcome all the panelists and everyone who's watching us from across the world. And I suggest anyone who wants to ask us a question at the end of the introductions and once we've had the opening remarks, could send us a tweet using hashtag CVF Summit Panel. And that should get us going. Let me set up an opening 2-minute point to getting the panelists on. One of the critical questions that we address when we look at resource use, climate change, and the way our planet's resources are mobilized and used is how do our lifestyles alter to make it easier and better, live longer and live healthier, and have better well-being at a lesser resource consumption level. This challenge is serious because at different levels of economies, different nations, different communities face different challenges of how to achieve a sustainable lifestyle system. Rich countries need to maintain their well-being, but perhaps do it at a less resource-consumptive pace. Poorer countries, vulnerable countries, need to eradicate poverty, bring people out of poverty, and at the same time make sure they do not lock in investments into lifestyles which are not sustainable in the long run. This balance is essential, and for this balance, we need governments, individuals, societies, businesses, all to operate together and to move towards a more efficient system of producing well-being, wealth, as well as prosperity for their people. What does it take? Does it take just technology? Does it take nudging, as some people call it? Does it take a set of regulatory frameworks? Does it take investments to go in the right direction? How do you get all this moving at different scales, from one which is very personal to all the way up where we look at international agreements and cooperation amongst people and nations? To try and answer these questions and perhaps find the right answers or at least the right hints of how to think about this, we've got a fantastic panel of people. To begin with, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ajay Mathur of the Energy Research Institute in India. TERI, as it's called, is also organizing this thematic track along with UN Environment. And I suggested Dr. Mathur can join and set up the opening remarks, followed by others as I'll introduce them later. And I'll please request all panelists to keep their first opening remarks to 5 minutes each. Dr. Mathur.
Many, many thanks, Nitin. And it's absolutely wonderful to co-host this thematic track on operationalizing sustainable lifestyles. I think the very fact that we are having this summit through virtual means is an indication of how we can move towards sustainable lifestyles rather than flying long distances to meet face to face. I hope that the success of this and hopefully subsequent ventures of this kind would greatly reduce the need for large meetings where large numbers of people spend large amounts of jet fuel to reach and talk on things which could be done over the internet. This is an example of how it is that we can move towards sustainable lifestyles. First of all, we need the business models, the technologies and the business models. If the internet didn't exist, if Zoom didn't exist, this particular meeting could not have been done. So the first point that I want to bring to the table is that within the existing world that we live in, what are the kinds of technologies, what are the kinds of business models that each one of us can adopt so that we move to a more sustainable future. So that's the first thing, Nitin, that I would like to flag as being important for operationalizing this, for making the change. But then the second issue is, if you want to really break out, what is needed then? In many, many cities in the US, tram lines were were actually taken out to be replaced by roads. That set an infrastructure where cars became the prominent mode of transport. And in many cities, if you're not living in a large metropolis, it is impossible, even if you want to move by public transport. You have to use cars. In other words, investment in infrastructure becomes important. Investment in infrastructure is driven by the state, and therefore I think it is important for us to think, how is it that the state can change its investment priorities? Each one of us has a role in it, and I'm hoping that we would focus on it. It's not just infrastructure, it's also policies. We notice that countries where resource efficiency policies are in place are able to do a lot more recycling, a lot more reuse of materials than in societies where such kinds of interventions do not exist. What this does is, therefore, if this happens, it unlocks the kinds of possibilities that we have. I hope that today's discussion is the start of a process through which individually and collectively we move towards sustainable lifestyles in our own contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Move on, and we have a special guest with us. We're very honored to have Honorable Ralph Dragonvanu, Minister for Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and External Trade for the Republic of Vanuatu. He's consented to give a special remark. I'll invite Minister to join us now and perhaps brief us for 5 minutes on the ideas he has for this panel's theme, as well as the larger ideas that he holds.
Thank you very much. I'm honored also to be on this panel. My country is a very small country in the South Pacific Ocean. We are a small island state. We are also a least developed country. And we are also a country of indigenous people. So what we have is a situation where we have a very low level of development, but that doesn't mean we are in poverty. In fact, the New Economics Foundation Happy Planet Index, which it publishes annually, has twice declared Vanuatu to be the happiest country on earth. And this is a country with some of the lowest GDP in the world, a least developed country with less than $1 a day per person. And we're still classed as a least developed country. But what it shows is that we have lifestyles that are largely informed by our traditional indigenous cultures, where we worked closely with our environment. And many of the outer islands, we're an archipelago of 80 islands, and many of the outer islands, we still don't have the grid, for example, grid electricity, sewerage, that kind of thing. But we are trying to leapfrog, as we had the former speaker talk about infrastructure, we are trying to leapfrog with our small population and find ways forward that are an alternative to the ways that we normally think about development. One good example is how we leapfrogged having phones, for example, in my country, and went straight to cell phones. Also, we are leapfrogging the grid, electricity grids, and going straight to solar and going to mini solar grids as a way of trying to meet the energy needs of our communities. So this is one aspect of sustainable lifestyles I want to talk about, is how we can have a lifestyle that is largely based on our traditional indigenous culture, and how can we make this work in the modern world. So another thing I want to talk about is the fact that Vanuatu became the first country in the world this year to ban plastic straws completely. At the same time, we also banned plastic shopping bags and polystyrene takeaway containers. And in our small island country, almost all of this plastic is imported into the country. So it's quite easy for us to just stop it, because we don't manufacture most of it in the country. And so we are now undertaking an audit after we did a study of the plastic that was in the environment, where it was coming from. We are now undertaking an audit to find out how we can deal with this plastic. And our objective is to completely eliminate plastic getting into the ocean. We have to find other ways of dealing with the plastic we use. We know that we cannot completely get rid of it, but at least we can stop it getting into the ocean. And that is being set as a national objective. We started off with these measures, and we hope to get there. We're also looking at trying to not go down certain development paths that we could. For example, mineral extraction, oil and gas, all of that kind of stuff. We are in a position where we can say, look, let's choose not to do that because we haven't started yet. This is also something we are looking at now, developing policies to guide our future development, so we try and maintain our country as clean, green, low emission, low ecological footprint of citizens. This is going to be very difficult with a growing population because we have a very fast growing population. But we were very happy the way the population seized upon the idea of the plastic ban, for example. I've really come on board with that. There's a lot of community activism going into trying to develop these alternative pathways. We've got a national business council that is involving hundreds of businesses working with the government. We also have a very active NGO network, the Vanuatu Climate Action Network, which is participating in this virtual summit, but also working closely with the government to find these solutions. And I think we are, as I said at the beginning of my statement, we are lucky in a way that we have a special kind of unique situation, which is shared by a number of the countries in the Pacific. In the Pacific Ocean, as you know, we are some of the smallest countries in the world, some of the least developed countries in the world. But what Vanuatu is trying to show is that from that position, you actually have a lot more opportunities to develop sustainable pathways of development than, for example, if we had gone through the whole industrialization process like many of the larger countries have done. So we are trying to see how we can avoid many of the pitfalls that have happened in other countries, trying to maintain and lift up the standard of living of our population without this standard of living resulting in greater carbon emissions or greater production of waste from plastic and so on. And that's a challenge the government has set itself. We have a National Sustainable Development Plan that came into effect in 2016 for the period of the SDGs. That development plan is very much centered on culture as the basis of the environment and economic and society pillars. And we're very much looking at trying to develop this new pathway to sustainable development that maintains the qualities of the environment and the society we have now, doesn't sacrifice them, and finds innovative ways to move forward based on both our tradition-based culture and such initiatives as, for example, this initiative to completely eliminate plastic waste, marine litter, plastic going to the ocean. Also, because we contribute so little of the global greenhouse gas emissions, trying to really go to total renewable energy by 2030, that's the national objective. Reduce emissions almost completely by that time also. And I think it's something that we feel that we can achieve because of where we are right now and the advantages of technology and so on that we're looking forward to incorporating into our development path. So these are some of the things I would just like to start the discussion off with. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister. It's fascinating to hear all the endeavors that your country is taking to reach a point that others perhaps will follow in due time. And also learning lessons that countries at different scales and different national circumstances can perhaps try and achieve. To add on to the conversation, I'll invite Ms. Anu Mandi, who's from Finland, works as a senior lead at the Resource Wise and Carbon Neutral Society. And actually taking off from the Minister, if I could suggest to you, tell us how sustainable livelihood, lifestyles, and climate change come together to interact and where we can take our societies and nations on this path.
Thank you. Have an honor to participate in this first virtual forum and really enjoy of not being forced to fly to an event and happy to take this from my home. So I'm going to talk about what are the sustainable lifestyles and how do they contribute to climate change, and especially we're interested in understanding how can we harness modern technologies to help our people to have their footprints. So our carbon footprint in Finland per capita is about 10 kilos CO2. So we belong to the team of high emitters here. So we should all have our footprints to even meet the global average. So however, we are also becoming aware of the burning fact that we should get down to 3 tons by 2030 and down to 1 ton by 2050. So how can we get there, or is it possible? It looks like and sounds like an impossible task for a nation like Finns. So I will tell you a little bit about what we innovated at the Finnish Innovation Fund and how we're on the way to become a little bit more sustainable society. And so I will now take you through some key points what we're doing here. So our test has now been taken over 500,000 times in Finland, and that is over 10% of our adult population. So we've processed over 3 megatons of lifestyle data in the area of housing, mobility, food, products, and services. And this data has been now processed on our mobile phones. So people are happy to take the test on their mobiles wherever they are, whenever they feel like knowing more about their footprints. So we're making it very easy for them to take the test and help them understand where do they stand and what can they do about their footprints. So far, these great news have been traveling pretty fast, and we're also helping governments, municipalities, businesses in Finland and abroad to apply our approach in a number of different ways. Next year, there will be global consumer brands introducing compelling carbon stories based on our recommendation and our calculations. And there will be also ways to provide helpful data for our policymakers here in Finland. So I think it's fair to conclude that we're on well to becoming an environmentally aware nation here in Finland, and we're ready to measure our impacts of our lifestyles to the environment. So we also understand that these lifestyles need to be available by default in order to get to emission reduction targets. Why by default? Because we know that people make environmentally sound decisions only if they see a benefit there, and the benefits must be about their health, saving money, saving time, or other compelling reasons to choose the more sustainable option. So how can we help people to make sound decisions? So we figured out that we need to help people to understand where they are with their footprints. So we want to understand such things as where do we stand, what is our capacity to perform and to contribute. So best of the tests become standards and internationally well known, such as Myers-Briggs or IELTS. So what did we do? We asked a very simple question at Sitra. So what are the most popular types of tests online that gets widely shared on social media? And how do we get Finns' attention to take the test and choose from tailored tips and help them enjoy their lives while having their footprints? How do we get there? So we know in traditional marketing, we talk about curiosity gaps, which are about desires to understand something strange and bustling, and to learn something new in order to get that pleasure rush. We saw that gap, but didn't understand how well our value proposition would meet the needs of a wider audience. So we decided to try. We created a test and we launched it a year ago. And so far we've gotten already 500,000 data points in our database. And basically, the invitation to the test was written. The headline was that, why don't we change? We really wanted to ask very honest, simple questions. We didn't want to make this sound too technical. And our honest questions make us look inward and investigate our realities. Moments of deep reflection are incredibly emotional, and emotions can help us change. So, how do I know if my current lifestyle is good or bad for the environment? What needs to change? Is it possible for me to cut my carbon footprint into half and improve my quality of life? So what are the constraints and how to overcome them? So we analyzed social media conversations and found out that people find it really hard to know where to start. What are the most important actions to take, and how to switch from our bad habits to the better ones? And last but not least, how much time do we have? We also saw that when people started measure what they were speaking about, we helped them to express it in numbers. They started suddenly knowing more about it. So they started forming opinions, and they started fixing this problem. So is it possible to turn this "we don't have time" feeling into powerful mitigation plans? People are hardwired to things that experiences that they perceive to be rare or in short supply. We know that scarcity is tied to our self-worth. And acquiring something uncommon in demand can make us feel very powerful. So now what do we do next? So how can we help people to have their footprints, and then what kind of questions are we addressing in 2019? So we will help people to understand how much time and money they need as an individual to complete their carbon plans. We will help them create their personal plans in a government project, which is led and supported by our President and Prime Minister, our government, everyone who's leading our country. But last but not least, we have a full support from our people. They are really interested in figuring out and creating their plans in order to meet the needs and the targets set by the Paris Agreement. So we will help them to understand what are the habits that are easiest to change and which are the ones that will take more time and effort to complete. We will help them understand which parts of their carbon budget are good to compensate and which are the ones that they need to fix in other ways. We will help them to understand what are the biggest mistakes to avoid and also where to seek for help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Again, fascinating to hear how big data, behavioral change, governments all working together, different ideas, different technologies, and different scales coming together to perhaps try and create a change. I'd like to introduce Ms. Pamela Mejia. She's the CEO, founder of Phoenix in Philippines. Business models are available now, or does she see coming, which could bring about a sustainable lifestyle and move us in that direction? Pamela?
Hi, everyone. Hello, greetings from Manila, Philippines. Like what Ethan had mentioned, I am actually a founder of Phoenix. Phoenix is a textile recycling center and is also a fashion social enterprise. Our mission is to collect textile waste, such as old clothes and fabric scraps, and transform them into higher value products, such as footwear and bags. So basically, we really run our operations in the fashion industry. And just as a background, my background is actually clothing technology and social entrepreneurship. And prior to actually founding Phoenix, I have been a fashion entrepreneur for almost 11 years already. And what really bothers me most as a member of the fashion industry is textile waste. And the fact that the fashion industry is actually the second largest polluter in the world, next to the oil industry. And the fashion industry is also the second largest user of water. But what really bothered me is that 85% of textiles actually end up in landfills. And here in the ASEAN region in Southeast Asia, even especially in my own country, we actually don't have our own textile recycling center, which is why this actually inspired me to found Phoenix as the premier textile recycling center in the Philippines. But other than that, actually, our main revenue driver is right now is actually our footwear and bags made from these textile waste. But in total, we are a fashion social enterprise, meaning we operate from the triple bottom line. We are for the planet, we are for the people, and we are for profit. So one, we are for the planet, as it is our mission to give solution to textile waste and to do product life extension. This way, we are championing Sustainable Development Goal number 12 and Sustainable Development Goal number 13. So we are really for sustainable production and consumption and climate change. Two, we are for the people. Our shoe and bag are the people who actually produced our shoes and bags from these textile waste are actually local artisans here in the Philippines who have previously lost their jobs due to competition with international companies. So now we are actually reviving their businesses and giving them more employment. Number two is that one of our techniques is we actually weave our textile waves. And our textile weavers are actually all people with disabilities. In fact, our best weavers are deaf and mute. At the same time, in creating our collections, we actually collaborate with local artists and designers. So this way, we also get to promote local art. And finally, for the people, we do workshops on textile recycling as well as sustainable fashion, so that we get to educate the people on why it is important to actually use sustainable fashion brands especially. So this way, we get to champion SDG 8. And finally, even with all of this, we are still for profit, as we believe that being financially sustainable will help us achieve our environmental and social goals. So at present, when we started, what we actually do is we directly cut from the fabric. So for example, from a dress, we actually directly cut our shoes and our bags from there. So just to show you a sample so you have an idea, our upcoming collection is this one. It's actually made from kimonos. So these are actually from authentic Japanese kimonos that were donated to us by a Japanese community that wanted to get rid of their authentic vintage kimonos. But now we are slowly developing our technology. Right now, what we do is we also cut the clothes into strips. We cut them into small strips and we weave them to a whole new fabric. So that's our technology is not really that high tech, but we are on our way there. And thankfully, when we had a competition in Shanghai, we got to be introduced to this company wherein they actually recycle these whole textile waste and turn them into fibers and then create them into a whole new fabric. And not only that, we're also exploring into making coffee grounds, like coffee ground waste, into new fabrics as well. But we still have a long way to go in actually developing that technology. And just recently, we got a grant from the United Nations Environment, and that allowed us to actually scale up our business. And we actually did a computation of our carbon footprint versus that of the carbon footprint of a regular footwear. And we found out that when we measured the carbon footprint of our whole textile recycling process down to collecting it, washing the clothes, processing, and actually producing the shoes and the bags, we found out through the United Nations Environment that our footwear is actually 97% less carbon footprint versus that of a regular footprint. And the whole inspiration of Phoenix really is like, if you guys are familiar with the bird, the phoenix bird, which dies and is reborn into a new bird. What we really want to do is to create something new from like the old ways that the fashion industry gives. And our main goal really is to do a closed loop and a circular economy in the fashion industry, starting here in Manila. So there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pramila. It's amazing hearing how perhaps different sectors of industry can innovate, specialize, and move in the right direction. You're providing example for one, particularly in the textile industry. I'm so sorry for having kept you waiting so long. Alexander Clark, who's the advisor for the Behavioral Insights team based out of Singapore. Thank you for your patience, and would you like to give your opening remarks now, Alexander?
Certainly. Thank you, Nitin. So as the introduction has been done for me, very, very ably, I can move directly on to what I really want to talk about today, which is firstly to introduce what we mean when we say behavioral insights, with an example of those, and then to talk briefly about some work that the behavioral insights team has been doing in terms of applying those behavioral insights around energy consumption. So when we say behavioral insights, what we're talking about are empirical findings about human behavior that can be used to make public policy more effective. So let me give a specific example of that. So the behavioral science literature refers frequently to this concept of social norms, this idea that we individually look to other persons to inform us about what the right behavior is. So this is kind of a product of us being social creatures, right? So if everyone else is doing it, it must be safe, it must be the right thing to do. And this has been used quite effectively in the realm of household energy consumption. So the way it works is you get your regular energy bill. It tells you how much your household has consumed over the last month. But additionally, it tells you how much your neighbors have consumed as well. So you get your consumption versus the average consumption. Now, the idea behind this is that if I'm above the average consumption, I start to realize that I am abnormal. There's something strange about my household. There's something different. And generally speaking, we don't like that. We don't like to see it. And so we respond appropriately. So this was originally done by some academics a few years ago now in the US. It was replicated all over the US. It's now spread all over the world. In fact, my electricity bills here in Singapore include information both on the average household as compared to mine, as well as my past performance as another kind of reference point. And in both cases, the results, the impact that you see is quite similar. What you see is that high consumers drop their consumption. Now, this wasn't anything about, there wasn't any kind of awareness raising aspect to this. It wasn't about kind of hearts and minds. It wasn't about changing values. It was just about reporting information in a behaviorally informed way, which led to a change in behavior. And I think that's really important for us to think about when we're thinking about building sustainable lifestyles, this idea that the way to do it, although obviously kind of instilling values around sustainability can be an avenue to achieving sustainable lifestyle change, it isn't the only way to do it. So information provision is one route where we can apply behavioral insights to make it more effective. Another, which we've been exploring in the UK with Nest, who produce smart thermostats, is how do you reduce household gas consumption without providing any information at all? And it's a technological solution here. The Nest smart thermostat will basically train its usage of your gas to heat your home based on the settings that you put in. So if you tend to like it about 22 degrees when you wake up and you pop the thermostat up to that, over time, the device itself starts to read that, starts to load it up in advance, which means you don't have to change anything. What that also means is that, say, when we forget to turn the heating off at night, when we're less likely to use it, the Nest thermostat starts to do that for you automatically, recognizing that you don't need to consume heat at this time. So we've actually done a series of evaluations in the UK of this thermostat. It's all available on our website, bi.team. But fundamentally, what we've been able to show through both quasi-experimental and experimental evaluations is that the Nest thermostat works. We see around a 7% reduction in household gas usage in terms of their gas system. And that's compared to you can get reductions of up to about 9% from insulation. I think wall insulation is the most effective, more so than loft insulation, but at a much greater cost. And the point here is that by using this technology and kind of applying behavioral insights into thinking about how we solve the problem, thinking that people are forgetful about using their gas, they're not that considered in all of their decisions, we can start to devise behavioral informed solutions that can move us towards those sustainable lifestyles. Now, for my part, the question is, obviously heating here in Singapore and Southeast Asia is often less of a concern for us. But I do wonder if there are opportunities in terms of air conditioning, which remains pretty profligate throughout the region. And I suspect also has the same problems of being suboptimally set. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of understanding what we mean when we talk about behavioral insights and how it can be applied to achieving sustainable lifestyles.
Sorry, I think I lost you guys for a minute here, but thank you, Alexander. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce our last panelist. I just kept you waiting longer because you also come from India, and I thought I could use that privilege. Wembley Jha was the founder, executive director of Swecha in India, and he'd like to speak on the role of sustainable production and consumption along this thematic panel. Please, Wembley.
Thank you, Nitin. And it's a great pleasure to be part of a virtual climate summit. In every sense, it's climate friendly in that sense. Otherwise, all these years, you actually damage more climate talking about climate in that sense. With regard to sustainable consumption and production, I think it's extremely important for us to understand whether sustainable consumption and production, is it a value or is it a strategy? And I would like to say that it needs to be a value rather than strategy, because strategies are short-lived, strategies are temporary, strategies are based on temporary intelligence and business interests versus value, which is actually on looking at sustainable practices, thinking about our planet, thinking about its people. In Indian context, I think it's extremely important for us to understand sustainable consumption and production, or for that matter, globally also, is that there are three primary players that we're talking about. So we're talking about consumers, we're talking about the producers, and then in between, we're actually talking about the government that actually is custodian of resources in that sense, and therefore should ideally be taking care of the consumers. And also is a regulatory body. So the government is between the producer and the consumer, trying to create a regime which is fair, which is just, which is sustainable, which is equitable, which is long-term in that sense. So it's very important for us to understand the role of all the three, the business, the government, and the end consumer in this larger discourse of sustainable consumption and production. Now, in India's context, and not just because last couple of years that we've started to talk about sustainable consumption and production, because that's a new conversation, that's a new term that has been coined. India's environmental policy or environmentalism in many ways is actually based on three primary things. One is, of course, sustainable development. The other is precautionary measures or say principles of precaution in that sense. And the third is polluter pays or polluter is responsible. In all these three virtues of India's environmentalism that we are talking about, as I said, be it precaution, be it sustainable development or producer or polluter in that sense pays, it's important to understand that a lot of it is supposed to be done, beginning of the pipe rather than end of the pipe. I think it's extremely important for us to understand that sustainable production discourse cannot be post-production, but it is actually pre-production. Similarly, sustainable consumption conversation cannot be completely rested on post-production that, find availability of resources. As I speak today, and as all of us are participating in this climate summit, I just want to tell you 3-4 instances that's also happening at the same time, India time, while we are on this climate summit. And it's important because it's not just in these summits, or this entire phenomenon is not just in isolation, but there is larger economic, social, political context in which this discussion needs to happen. As we are having this conversation right now, there are more than 100,000 people, more than 100,000 farmers protesting in west part of India, in our financial capital called Mumbai. And these are farmers that are actually going through agrarian distress because of several reasons. Some of it is, of course, climate change, and a lot of it is also the largely economic policy or production policy, and which also leads to almost 20,000 farmers or more than that actually commit suicide every year because of agrarian distress. So we're talking about today, there's a situation where farmers are protesting. There's New Delhi, which has actually virtually become a gas chamber. Right now, the air quality index this morning was also extremely unhealthy, hit severe condition in that sense. We've also looked at Chennai, which is the down south. There's a metropolis in that sense that actually has a flood situation coming right now, and year after year we have these situations. So these three phenomena or three events that's actually happening while we speak today in our country is the reason why it's important to really talk about sustainable consumption and production, because it has a direct linkage with all these three events that I just mentioned, and three metros that, by the way, I'm talking about. I'm talking about Delhi, I'm talking about Chennai, and I'm talking about Mumbai in that sense. So in all of this, India, of course, needs to look at this not just from a point of view of economics, because a lot of times, every time we talk about sustainable consumption and production, there's a conversation around circular economy, and it's largely again an economic term, and a lot of focus is on resources and less on people. I think there needs to be some amount of shift in our conversation around circular economy or on sustainable consumption and production, that who are the people who actually get affected the most if our consumption is unsustainable and if our production is unsustainable. Who are the end affected in that sense? Because the conversation right now is not just about how good environmentalism needs to exist in our life or in our businesses, but it's about how we are actually losing a major chunk of our population, and that's where it's actually linked to environmental justice. That most of the people who get affected because of unsustainable consumption or unsustainable production are the poorest of the poor, in the most vulnerable groups, and therefore this discussion or this value or this strategy or this entire phenomena needs to be pushed at the earliest in developing economies and in developed economies. We've spoken about finite resources, infinite and finite, this entire confusion that we talk about. So unless and until we start re-looking at extraction of resources itself, rather than just post-extraction, post-consumption use of it, we will not be able to solve this problem of sustainable consumption production, or linking this to entire issues of climate change. That climate change is too close to countries like India. and to vulnerable groups in India, Bangladesh, and many other countries that we talk about in the Indian subcontinent and other parts of the world. There are measures, there are some interesting case studies, there are interesting stories of people and institutions and businesses trying to do something about it to really mitigate in some way or prevent the entire thing in some way. But at the speed at which the depletion of resources or unsustainability is becoming the mainstream norm, and the speed at which we are trying to fix it as institutions, there's a huge gap. So we need to rush, we need to hurry as citizens, we need to hurry as governments and as businesses to really somewhere control this phenomena. And the other thing is, where do we stand vis-a-vis culture? Like, where are we culturally a very sustainable society? Are we not, or is modern culture unsustainable, old culture unsustainable? These are discussions that needs to happen, and we need to look at culture itself, or culture-based consumption also with a little bit of critique, with a little bit of critical lens. Because in India, for example, there's a lot of consumption that happens. Like right now, last couple of years, some of us have actually been fighting against firecrackers, for example. It's a kind of consumption, faith-based consumption over that we do, where we pollute the air in the name of culture, in the name of faith-based consumption. We need to really critically look at all of it. So I think it's to end what I was trying to say, that it needs a lens of environmental justice. It needs to go beyond the discourse of economics. It needs to look at the most vulnerable group who will be affected, or who are actually affected the most because of the unsustainable nature of our economics or of our politics.
Thank you so much, Vimlendu, and thank you to all the panelists for setting up the conversation with your opening remarks. As you might know, we're getting in questions and starting to roll in, and because we're short of time, we're looking at another 10 to 11 minutes of conversation. I think let's get on with the question. I'll read it out, and then whichever of you would like to address it, if you could just take a call on that one. The first question that we got in from Twitter is, what way is there moving forward to foster public transportation with reduced carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions? Alexander, would you perhaps want to address this? Yes.
There is one thing that I'd love to say about this, because I read a paper on it this morning, which I'd like to be able to relate. So this was a few years ago in Japan, where, as many of us know, they have a really great public rail system available. And the authors of this academic paper were looking at a freeway closure for 7 days between Osaka and a nearby commuter city. So lots of people drive from one to the other, for work and everything else. And so there was going to be this 7-day freeway closure. And they surveyed kind of people who were using this freeway, both before and after. And they were tracking things like chiefly their estimates of how long it would take to make that journey driving a private car on the freeway versus how long it would take if you were using the train, if you were taking public transport. And what they saw was that the people who drove most frequently tended to massively overestimate how long it would take to do that journey via train. Similarly, what they also found is that as a result of the freeway being closed, those people who did switch to public transport rather than taking an enormous extra round trip in their car, they obviously quite quickly learned that it didn't take anywhere near as long on the train as they had thought. And the suspicion is that would then influence them to take public transport more frequently. And I think there's actually other evidence of similar things. We've seen this in London quite frequently. There's been some academic studies of tube strikes that shows that when the subway system shuts down, it forces people to take new routes, to experiment with new transport, and hopefully sometimes more sustainable transport. So there's a couple of things that's worth bearing in mind here. If we want to shift people onto public transport, we need to bear in mind that there may be quite a lot of misconceptions in terms of the communities or the individuals who we most want to shift their behavior. In this case, in the Osaka example, the guys and girls who were driving the most are the ones who had the most inflated sense of how long it would take if they switched. But by giving them an opportunity to basically experiment with public transport, they were able to kind of break those misconceptions and, you would hope, provide opportunities or grow the user base of that kind of public transport system. So I think when we're thinking about ways to get people onto when we want to foster public transportation, we need to be thinking about how we're going to get people onto public transport. And one of the things is not necessarily going to be, as I say, hearts and minds. It might just be, a free travel for one day. Just things that will make people try it out, make people realize that their conceptions about this are misconceptions, and maybe change their transport behavior in the long term.
Hey, thanks. I was also reminded of the opening notes by Dr. Mathur when he was talking about how do you build your cities make so much of a difference. And across the world, particularly in developing world, cities are coming up, cities are being built. Now it's important that the cities come up the right way, the transportation systems are built to be more sustainable than perhaps they've been done elsewhere before. Let's move on to our second question. Maybe, I know you'd like to address this because it does look at large data and how we address that. Says, can we have a system of measuring impact of developmental choices on environment and express it via either green GDP or some other measure? What are the metrics along which you can measure sustainable lifestyles?
Maybe I can come, or
Please
Alex, do you want? Okay, let me comment this shortly first. I'm wondering what is meant by impact of development choices, but from my point of view, I think that we shouldn't introduce new metrics, but we should try to understand how international standards and metrics today, such as GDP and greenhouse gas emissions and footprints, can be harnessed and taken into use in a way that we start understanding the impacts of our everyday choices and how they add up to these numbers. And the other point is that we should also maybe introduce additional, not new measures, but additional measures next to these, which are about how many of us have their personal plans. How are we going to fix our everyday routines and behaviors in order to help solve this massive problem?
Anyone else on the panel who would like to respond to that question before we move on to the third one?
Yes, I was going to respond to that as well. Vanuatu has been inspired by Bhutan and the use of gross national happiness as an index, as the principal index for measuring the quality of people's lives and development in that country. And Vanuatu is similar to Bhutan in size. We're a micro-state. We are a large ocean state, of course, in the Pacific, but we're also similar size in terms of the area and the population. And we have actually come up with one of these extra matrices or extra measurement tools in addition to the existing ones we have. And this we came up with this after a long period of research. We did lots of partnerships with Bhutan to understand how they measured their gross national happiness, and we've come up with it's a Vanuatu well-being index, and it measures the extent to which traditional practices are carried out on a day-to-day basis by households and communities. So there's indexes of things like access to land on which to grow food. Free access, as in the ancestral land that you have. How much is it there? How much food you access from that plot of land? It also talks about values. It talks about participation in ceremonies. This is all to measure the extent to which the traditional indigenous culture is still maintained in people's development choices. And as I was saying before, we are trying to keep the best of what we have already in that traditional indigenous culture, which has been so good at maintaining a good environment to date. And while we come up with, the Western world and globalization and all these other choices coming in, trying to maintain these values and measure them so that we can say, when we do a development choice, is this going to reduce people's access to free ancestral land on which to grow their food? That becomes a measure as well as the measure of GDP. This is a development option that will increase perhaps revenue for the government, but the opportunity cost as measured by this other indicator is the loss of communities' access to land on which to grow food, which makes them become dependent on store-bought food, and therefore we can much more accurately measure the impact of particular development choices on the quality of life that people have continued to enjoy, and if they will continue to enjoy that quality of life if this development choice was made. So this is a very new thing. We've mainstreamed it into our national statistics office. It's now become mainstream. So we do actually use it now in terms of trying to measure the impact, and we will be measuring the effectiveness of our National Sustainable Development Plan, monitoring and evaluation of that plan using these new indices that we have developed alongside the other ones. And I think that other countries in the Pacific are watching what we're doing. So it's becoming a bit of a model. And we're very happy that we've got to the stage where the government has actually adopted it and brought it into the mainstream. And we can now start to evaluate development choices according to these measures as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. It's interesting to know how different countries are trying different things and different metrics and perhaps different methods of reaching the same point. As you developed a set of metrics to take you to the right path, Finland, as Anu suggests, is not saying build new metrics, but look at what exists, look at that data carefully and move people in the right direction. If I can move to the third question that's come in to us from somebody who's viewing us, to what extent can social practices in terms of the 3 Rs, reduce, reuse, and recycle, be adopted on a larger scale? And would that adoption be voluntary, or would it require a resource efficiency policy being mandated by the governments? Wembley, could I request you to address this?
Sure. So I think, we've been hearing about the 3 Rs for the longest time, for several decades. In fact, one of the first environmental, if I could use the word jargon, that our children learned, or we as children learned several decades ago, was these 3 Rs: reduce, reuse, recycle. And if despite that being in our education system, being part of our living room conversation, if this still hasn't translated into a very, very binding value for our society, I think it's important that we move towards a larger policy decision, a more legally binding decision, rather than just a voluntary decision. And I think that's where many countries are actually moving towards that. So if you look at this entire policy that India has, or India is moving towards, is the extended producer's responsibility / liability, which also means that a producer needs to really take back post-consumption waste in that sense. And that is that shift, or that gradual improvement that you'd say, that perhaps naturally, voluntarily, it would not make business sense for production houses or for businesses to do it. But if it's actually mandated in law, perhaps people will have to do it, organizations will have to do it. So given the urgency of the situation, Nitin, and given the fact that we have left it voluntary for the longest time, right now they will have to get into a legal framework where some of these violations or some of these values need to be written in law, defined in law, and of course it needs cooperation from everyone, and rather than actually just saying that we have a law, we'll have to enforce the law, because one of the biggest challenges that we actually face in countries like India is that we have fabulous laws in place about everything under the sun vis-a-vis environment, but it's at the end of the day, it's about enforcement by the agencies, that therefore governance, and the other is acceptance of that law by the citizenry at large. And I think that's what is extremely important.
Thanks, Wembley. I wanted to bring Pamela in. Pamela, there's a question that's come in that I think you could answer for us. Is sustainable livelihood seems to be a phenomena which is largely a niche at the moment. It does not go beyond this niche. How would you think things that you're doing are not called niche textile design at the end of the day, perhaps, or becomes a larger movement that everyone practices? We've got about 2 minutes before the session closes, so Pamela, quickly, if you could answer that.
Oh, yeah, sure. But like for Phoenix, right, when we started actually promoting and asking people for textile waste donation, our first expectation are actually people from the fashion industry or people who actually understand sustainable fashion. But what I noticed is that 90% of the people who actually donated to us are just regular people who wanted to get rid of their textile waste. So I guess it's good to say that even if we always brand ourselves as sustainable fashion, or we talk about textile waste, the people who actually reach out to us are not from that industry. So I guess we are good in sharing our mission, that our mission really is just to be to take care of the earth by actually getting rid of textile waste. So in that way, we are out of this niche that people think that we are in. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pamela. We are running out of time at the moment. I'd just like to take the chance to thank everyone on the panel for the time you spent with us. It's a privilege hosting all of you on the same place, and let's hope we do this again repeatedly instead of perhaps sometimes meeting face to face, but sometimes doing it this way. Thank you for your notes. Thank you for everything that you've done, or the effort you put in to be here. Thank you to our viewers who've stuck on listening to this at different hours and presumably across the world. This is 7 of us signing off from the CVF Virtual Summit 2018. Hopefully a start that we'll see repeat itself every year. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Keep those.
Thank you.